Hey everyone, it's Larry Kotlikoff back with Economics Matters, the podcast. I'm delighted to have my longtime buddy Greg Mankiw with me today. Uh, Greg is an extraordinary economist. I think he's really a household name. He might be the most well-known economist in the world uh, because his textbooks, both the introductory economics textbook books, book, I guess, uh, Principles of Economics, as well as his intermediate macroeconomics textbook, uh, have been, the most widely read and used throughout the U.S. and I think large parts of the world. So, welcome, Greg. It's great to have you. I'm going to say a couple words about your background, and then we'll talk about a whole range of things, including how you got into this business and how you got into this focus on teaching. But also, you're an extraordinary academic, but you also have had an extraordinary career in public policy, working as chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors under President Bush. So I'm just going to briefly kind of read out a bit of your bio here from Wikipedia. Uh, so Greg is a fellow New Jerseyan. I was born in Pensacola, New Jersey, next to Camden. Greg was born in Trenton, New Jersey, and neither of us have a strong New Jersey accent to our, I guess I would say, credit. Anyway, Greg's a professor of economics at Harvard University, and he's done a lot of work on new Keynesian economics, but also lots of very interesting work on all kinds of topics, theoretical as empirical. He's an economist. He's just such a great communicator, and his writing is beautiful, so that anybody can really follow what he's saying. He's ranked as one of the most influential economists in the world when you look at his citations and publications and other metrics. He's as I mentioned, the author of several best-selling textbooks. He writes a popular blog from 2007 to 2021. He was a regular columnist for the New York Times in their Sunday business section, and the he's also has this background in working with the government. He was the chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors under President G.W. Bush, and that was during the period 2003 to 2005. In 2006, he became an economic advisor to Mitt Romney when Romney ran for president, and he worked with Romney. Well, that was before he ran for president, and he was I guess, the chief economics advisor to Romney during his presidential campaigns in 2008 and 2012. And then in 2019, October of 2019, this lifetime Republican, Greg Mankiw, disowned the Republican Party because of his disaffection with President Trump and the Republican Party, and he hasn't rejoined. So we'll talk about that a bit. But I want to say, first of all, thanks so much for joining us, Greg. And let's start with, your very beginnings. You were born maybe as an 8-pounder. You're a pretty tall guy. Tell us about how you went from a baby to a professor of economics at Harvard University, and
Well,
and getting tenure at age 29. You had a meteoric path. You got you were summa cum laude at Princeton. You got your PhD at MIT, working with the late Stan Fisher, fantastic economist, and so. And along the way, you toyed with the law and economics, and or law, and you also took some astrophysics. I saw in the Wikipedia. So you're thinking about maybe physics, but you ended up in economics. Anyway, fire away.
Well, first of all, it's always great to talk to you, Larry. Usually when we have conversations, it's just the two of us, but it's nice to do it in front of an audience as well. So it's always great to see you. So let me just tell you a little bit about my background. As you said, I was born in Trenton, and I basically stayed in New Jersey through college. I went to Princeton as an undergrad, so obviously was there for New Jersey, my first 22 years of life. For some reason, I got it in my head early on that being a professor was a good gig. And that was it's kind of surprising because neither of my parents had gone to college. So I don't know exactly how I got this idea of being a professor was a good idea, but I did. I think I had this vague recollection of reading a book where there was a character that had a professor in it, and I said, "Well, this seems like a good lifestyle," and that was absolutely correct. And being a professor is a fantastic lifestyle. If you can do well in this career, it's a very, very pleasant career to have. And so I got it in my head early on. I wanted to be a professor, but I didn't know a professor of what. And I entertained a variety of ideas when I was in college. I remember taking a freshman philosophy course, thinking, oh, maybe I'll go get a PhD in philosophy. And the grad student said, no, 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 no. The grad student was running the section. She said, no, don't do that. There's no jobs in philosophy. It's a terrible thing to do to get a PhD in philosophy. So I quickly just decided not to do that. I did look her up, by the way, recently, and she's now a prominent professor at Duke. So she did okay, but she was discouraging others from going into philosophy. My first declared major was math, because I liked math in high school. I thought I was good in math, and I guess I was by the standards of a small high school. But then when I got to Princeton and I was playing the big leagues, I realized wasn't great at math. I was okay. I was good at math, but not great at math. So I would have made a very good high school math teacher if I could never have been a professor of mathematics. And so I started looking around for different things to do. And I happened to be dating this young woman. And she was taking an economics course, first semester freshman year. And she would come back from her classes and tell me what she was learning. And I thought that sounded more interesting than anything I was learning in any of my classes. And so I started taking economics my second semester, freshman year. And my first course was from Harvey Rosen, who's an absolutely fantastic teacher. I know you know Harvey, because you're both students of Marty's, right? Roughly the same time, not exactly. So Harvey got me interested in economics. Shockingly, he hired me as his research assistant after my freshman year. I knew almost no economics. I only took the principles course at that point, but I did know some Fortran programming, and he needed somebody to do some programming for him. And so he basically taught me the economics he needed me to know. And I went and did the Fortran programming. This is the days of punch cards and mainframe computers, nothing like the technology of today. But I had taken some computer science courses in the past. And so working for Harvey was really a turning point for me. And he's been a lifelong friend ever since. When I was a senior, I started getting more interested in macroeconomics, and I did write my senior thesis with Alan Blinder, who's another sort of great economist, and that really got me interested in macro. I also spent a couple summers when I was in college working as a summer intern at the Congressional Budget Office in their macro group, and that got it so I got to see the academic side of economics and the policy side, and I loved the way economics. The way economics sort of brings in different things. There's an academic side of it, there's a practical side of it. I really sort of love that, and I've tried to participate in a variety of facets of economics throughout my career. When I then went to grad school, I still wasn't completely sure what to do. So as you mentioned briefly, I did spend a year and a half in law school at Harvard Law School. Decided that wasn't for me. But I really enjoyed. I also started grad school at MIT, and I had two really fantastic mentors there. The first was Larry Summers, who was when I first arrived at MIT, he was there. He hadn't gone back to Harvard yet, so he was an assistant professor at MIT, and he was a great mentor to me. And then I did my dissertation under Stanley Fischer, who was really one of the best human beings I've ever met. It's so many different dimensions. So that sort of really set me on my path. And then I joined the Harvard faculty, and I've other than my 2 years in Washington, I basically haven't left because it's an ideal job. I love Harvard. I love what the classes I teach, and I love the students. So it's been as idyllic a career as I imagined it would be back when I was a high school student thinking about careers.
So you've been teaching people should understand that when you teach undergraduates, freshmen, when you teach, let's say, freshman economics at EC 101, and they're using Mankiw, the book, the textbook, you're teaching in, I forget the name of this huge building.
Memorial Hall, Sanders Theater, which is
Sanders
in the
Theater.
Memorial Hall.
It's a gorgeous wooden structure with what, like 400 kids, 400, 500
Yeah,
kids.
yeah, it's between 500 and 700 depending on the area.
Yeah, and there, yeah, balconies, and you're up there lecturing. So was that intimidating the first time you did it? Was that?
Well, I spent my one semester teaching at MIT before I joined Harvard, and I had a MIT student who had me in that as an undergraduate class at MIT, and then she had me a few years later
Mhm.
when I teaching as a graduate student at Harvard when she went to grad school, and she said, "You seem a lot less nervous than you did when you started teaching." So I think when I was at the beginning, she told me at the very beginning, and so I must have been somewhat nervous. It was obvious to her, but over time you kind of get used to it. Like a lot of things in life, is learning by doing, and I think I've gotten more comfortable with public speaking over time.
Now, so just on that, when did you really become kind of a public uh, persona where you're speaking about economics to the general public? Was this before you became head of the council? I know.
Well, before that, I was to think I was writing some columns for the general public. I wrote for a while. I was writing for Fortune magazine, actually, and that Fortune magazine hired two economists, myself and Paul Krugman, and we took turns. So he wrote one for one issue, and then I wrote for the next issue this week. So for a while, we were taking turns, and that was probably the first time I was writing for the general public, not counting the textbooks, but just sort of writing about public policy for a general lay audience. And that was sort of my first attempt at that. I mean, I guess if you really go back, in college, I actually wrote a column for the school newspaper. So I was always kind of interested in writing for general audiences. I was just interested in the process of writing and not just reaching out to other academics. So, I did do some of that in college, and that sort of practice. I guess that was practice for sort of doing it for grown-ups. Once I
So you had
became
this longstanding interest in making economics matter. Which,
yes.
that comes the title of this podcast, Economics Matters. Uh, so when you became the chair of the Council of Economic Advisors, was this like, I mean, it's a big deal. Only, it's a great honor. It's a great responsibility and a lot of work. I was a staff member of the Council of Economic Advisors, but you have to do a lot of public uh, presentations. You're answering the press, being in front of cameras. Did you find was that something you kind of was all natural at that point? Maybe.
Again, I think I got better at it and more comfortable at it over time.
Yeah.
The White House did give me a little media training. Basically, they give you some pointers. A lot of it's kind of obvious. You don't want to publicly disagree with the president. I remember when I was at my confirmation hearing, Senator Schumer was trying to get me to get ahead of the president on a particular issue. The president hadn't decided about whether to have a further extension of unemployment insurance, and Senator Schumer wanted me to take a stand one way or the other, to basically pressure the president to do what he wanted him to do. And I remember he kept saying, "Well, what would you advise the president?" And I said, "Well, I advise the president there are pros and cons of this. This is the pros, here are the cons." And so, I said, life, economics is all about trade-offs, and I'd explain the trade-offs to him. But so you kind of learn that politicians are often playing a game, especially in the public settings. It's funny. After Schumer sort of did this and tried to sort of back me in a corner in the public hearing, after it was over, he ran up to me to shake my hand, and my daughter who was in the audience, and she was like, I think, I don't know, 10 or 11 at the time. And so he was super friendly when the cameras were turned off, and then he was obviously much more confrontational when the cameras were on during the hearing.
Rather aggressive, yeah. But so what was it like being chairman? Were you seeing the president routinely? You have any?
Yeah, I was actually the president probably two or three times a week. Usually, not very rarely one-on-one. It's usually in meetings of a dozen people discussing some issue. You're absolutely right. They're hard jobs. I worked longer hours during those 2 years than I ever have in my life. by far. I mean, every day in the Bush White House started with a 7:30 a.m. staff meeting in the Roosevelt room, which is the conference room right next to the Oval Office. 7:30 a.m. I'll say in my 40 years at Harvard, not one meeting has ever started at 7:30 a.m. No one would even suggest a meeting that early. Even
So
8:30 they're ungodly early.
who's showing up at 7:30? The chief of staff and you
Chief
and
of
who?
staff would run the meeting. Yes, exactly. Andy Card was chief of staff, and then everybody, the head of the different White House offices. So the head of OMB was there, the head of the National Security Council was there. So I would see people like Condi Rice or Steve Hadley and Josh Bolton and Karl Rove as a political advisor. So basically, there's roughly, must be 15, 20 people in the room. Everybody had their assigned seats. I got to sit right next to Scooter Libby, who was the chief of staff for Dick Cheney, on the
ends
couch.
up going to jail, right? He ended up in jail.
He ended up going to jail. Yes,
Yeah.
yes. Fortunately, I never came close to anything like that. But I didn't know that part of Scooter Libby's life that he got involved in these national security issues.
How financially secure do you feel? Imagine a tool to help you make smart financial decisions. A tool that factors in all your financial data and shows what you can safely spend every year for the rest of your life. That tool is Maxify. Powerful, accurate, and easy to use. Developed by Boston University economist Lawrence Kotlikoff, Maxify takes the guesswork out of financial decisions at every stage of life. Maxify calculates what you can afford to spend now and throughout retirement. And you can run what-if scenarios to see how your finances might change by taking a new job, buying a home, or downsizing. Knowing the impact before you decide lets you make smarter decisions so you can finally enjoy financial peace of mind. Are you ready? Visit Maxify.com today to start planning. That's Maxify with an I. Maxify. Maxify.com.
And with that many people, is this like an hour-long meeting?
Yeah, 45 minutes. I mean, it's really just a sort of an overview of what's happening, so that if there's anything happening, everybody's aware of it. What are the key issues? Now, the news cycles are so fast in Washington that everybody wants to stay on top of everything all the time.
And
So they really want to make sure that everybody knows, what are we thinking about? What's the, what are the issues that are the most pressing right now? And it was a fairly quick meeting, and then the people go on and do their things. There are rare issues that all the different parts of the White House complex need to meet on, because usually there's narrower responsibilities. So like I'd see Condi Rice at those meetings, or Steve Hadley from the National Security Council, but it's rare that the National Security Council and the Council of Economic Advisors have to work together. I mean, on some international trade issues, it involves both economics and foreign policy, but most foreign policy issues it's pretty separate from most economic issues.
So not everybody's going to talk at every meeting. There's probably some topic that the chief of staff is focused on, or is it just you listen, or do you actually?
It varies. I mean, if there was economic data coming out, they would often turn to the CEA chair to talk about that.
Mm-hmm.
But it depends whether the chief of staff was particularly interested in focusing on that day. It was really up to the chief of staff to set the tone and the topics for the day.
I see. And then when you met with the president, do you have any, without revealing any, things that are confidential, what was President Bush like? I mean, what was it like?
President Bush was a super nice guy. I mean, he was just a really nice human being, and he wasn't very different in private than he was in public. I mean, he was super friendly, gregarious. It was very different from Dick Cheney, by the way, who was also friendly but much more taciturn in his demeanor. Mm-hmm. Bush was much more gregarious. But the one thing that impressed me most about George Bush was how good he was at making the staff be loyal to him. A typical meeting would have either in the Oval Office or the Roosevelt Room, depending how big it was, would have staffers at different levels. There'd be obviously the most important people, like the Secretary of Treasury, but then might be some assistant or deputy assistant secretary of Treasury who was lucky enough to get at that meeting for whatever that topic was, because he or she was working on it. And President Bush would frequently call out that person the lowest ranked person in the room and start chatting with him. So rather than just talking to the Secretary of Treasury who's sitting next to him, he would talk to the guy at the back of the room and saying, hi John, how's your kids doing? How's Jane? He's probably prepped on it before the meeting, but John, the fact that the President of the United States called on him just to say hi at the beginning of the meeting, the fact that he even knew who he was, that John is now going to be loyal to the president forever because the president recognized him in this meeting. And George Bush was very, very good at that, developing a personal connection to people that generated a tremendous amount of loyalty to him as a person. So even when you didn't agree with what the president was doing, you felt like, okay, I think he's doing the best he can, and I like him, so I'm going to try to be as supportive as I can be.
And now the Iraq War is happening at this point, right?
Yeah, it was. I came in February of 2003, so the Iraq War was just starting.
I see. And was that dominating every day's discussion? I mean, was this
often?
Mhm.
At the beginning, we were wondering whether there would be any macroeconomic implications. And I remember at the beginning, I was meeting after that meeting. I had a regular meeting with Steve Friedman, who was head of the National Economic Council, and Alan Greenspan, who came in from the Fed, who was Fed chair at the time. And the three of us and a few staffers would basically get together and review what's going on with the economy. Because we were kind of wondering, would the war trigger some economic event? It really didn't. So in the end, we ended up not stopping these meetings after a few months, but we would very regularly, I can't remember if it was every day at first or maybe 3 times a week, to get together just to see, what's going on with the economy. Is it worth having any implications? So there was that side of the war. But then, there would, in the big chief of staff meeting, there was always a report from the National Security Council, typically. And this is why when people say, oh, Bush and Cheney lied themselves into war, I'm absolutely sure that's wrong. Because they really thought there were going to be weapons of mass destruction. Steve Hadley, who's at that point number 2 at the National Security Council, came in several times saying, don't worry, we'll find these weapons of mass destruction any day now. They really believed that. Now, there might have been a lot of confirmation bias interpreting the evidence and so on. So that there were mistakes is almost surely the case. But when people say that they lied, I'm sure that's not right, because they believe the CIA intelligence. I remember at the time, I don't know if you remember, there's this famous presentation in front of the UN by Colin Powell.
Colin Powell, right?
Yeah, exactly. And I remember Colin Powell presenting these photos that he said were evidence of these weapons of mass destruction. And I remember watching these presentations on TV. Actually, I wasn't there, of course, but I remember watching them and saying, must be, I guess you need to be an expert to interpret these photos, because I can't see anything in these photos. But I think they, and this is where I thought the confirmation bias may have come in. I think they saw more than was really there, and they interpreted evidence in a way to confirm preconceived notions. Now, he would never say this, but my personal guess is that George Bush would not have started this war if the CIA had been more circumspect about the intelligence.
So do you think Cheney got the CIA to Cheney seemed to be gung-ho for this, to do this.
Well, I don't think he got the CIA to lie. I think, one thing I think we know from behavioral economics is that confirmation bias is an incredibly pervasive phenomenon in life. I think it's to me, that's one of the big things I've learned from behavioral economists. And I think that's what was going on. They had a view that this was a bad guy. Saddam Hussein was a bad guy, and that Saddam Hussein wouldn't let the inspectors in. So why wouldn't he let the inspectors in if he didn't have anything to hide? Well, maybe he had other motivations. But
right.
I think they had this worldview, and when George Tenet, he famously came into the Oval Office. I was not there, but this has been widely reported. He came into the office and say, "Oh yes, of course, there's weapons of mass destruction. It's a slam dunk." That's the phrase used. It's a slam dunk, meaning we're sure. It wasn't a slam dunk. I mean, if they had said, oh, it's 60-40, the presidential decision might well have gone another way.
What about just the decision to run the country? It's one thing to go in there and send special forces and double check that there's nothing, whatever's there, get rid of Saddam Hussein, kind of what we've done here in Venezuela with Maduro. It's another thing to land boots on the ground and stay there for whatever, was ended up with lots and lots
Yeah,
of.
I don't. That's a good question. I was not part of that. That was a. That was. I mean, I think that in some sense, he was naively optimistic. He really thought he could create a flourishing democracy there. I don't think he appreciated the difficulty that it would have been. One person you might have on this podcast to talk about this sometimes is Chris Foote. I don't know if you know Chris Foote. He's now at the Boston Fed, but he actually went and spent a year in Iraq working with the team to try to put together that economy. So he would have some interesting stories to tell about it.
This was with Wolfowitz.
What's the guy named? Who's the guy? Brimmer?
Oh yeah, Brimmer. Yeah, there was right.
Brimmer. I think I was running that operation at the time.
Andrew Brimmer. Right? Andrew. Yeah. Right.
Ian? I don't remember. I can't remember. I forget his name.
Well,
he was there for a year. He has to be, so he'd be an interesting person to
just since we're on this, what's your take on this Trump's intervention in Venezuela, and he seems to be heading towards intervening in Iran, and at least taking out some part of their defensive or offensive capabilities, as well as maybe the current Ayatollah, and then it's the head of Cuba.
Well, I must confess, I try to avoid publicly opining on things that are well beyond my area of expertise. And this is well beyond my area of expertise. And there's no question that the regimes in Venezuela and Cuba and Iraq, Iran are bad regimes. There's no, I have no doubt that the people are being treated very badly. The question is, what's the role of the United States in trying to change bad regimes into better regimes?
Yeah.
I don't know.
Frankly, getting rid of Maduro is the first thing that Trump's done that I've liked.
Yeah, no, I don't. There's no question he's a bad guy.
Yeah.
So I can, but to what extent should we go into countries where we think they have bad regimes in order to try to fix them? Are we capable of that? What's the limits? I mean, in Venezuela, I'm kind of worried. The one thing that concerns me is he doesn't seem to want to really change the regime there to the democratically elected government. He wants to get the oil. So it seems to be more of an economic motivation than a democracy motivation. That concerns me. It seems a little too nakedly self-interested. But we're not good at changing regimes. So I honestly don't know what the right policy is. I have a friend, by the way, who's an expat from Iran, close friend of who lives in the same building I do. He's now a venture capitalist in Boston, so he's doing a very different kind of thing than he was doing if he stayed in Iran. But he's very optimistic about the current protests, that he thinks that actually regime change might be on the horizon there. And Iran could be a very successful country, as it's been at sometimes in the past. This theocracy they have there is they're a bunch of thugs, basically.
Yeah. It's amazing, how important Iran has been through the history of the world. There's, going back, Persian Empire. It's always played a big role in the world, or oversized role, I would say. Interesting. Since we're on this a little bit before we start talking, because I really want to get into your research, because I think that looking at your greatest hits and hearing from you about those will be of great interest. But what led you to the decision to to leave the Republican Party? And do you have any kind of overall comments about the second iteration of Trump and what's happening to the rule of law and support for education and basic science and decisions on vaccines and the people that he has running the administration. To me, this is some form of fascism or a path towards fascism. But give us your.
Yeah, no, I agree with that sentiment. I've always viewed myself as a sort of a libertarian at the margin. By that I mean, the Libertarian Party seems too extreme to me, but given where we are now, a little bit more, less government, a little more freedom is the right direction. So moving our country in the direction of Milton Friedman, if not all the way to Milton Friedman, I always thought it would be a good thing. So that's made me sort of more conservative on economic issues and more liberal on social issues. So I've been in favor of same-sex marriage, for example, but I ended up in the Republican Party because on economics, I do believe in more limited government, and I think that the Republican Party tends to be the party for more limited government on economic issues. That's no longer true under Donald Trump. If you think of I saw this at first when he started talking about international trade. I thought the fact that he's putting all these tariffs on is not a shock given his history. He's been a skeptic of free trade for a very long time. I saw that in his first, even before he was elected the first time. But in some sense, that's the least of it now. I think you're absolutely right. I mean, he's just putting a lot of very bad, incompetent people in. People like Stephen Miller, people like RFK Jr. These are not good people. And he wants to centralize power in a way that I find is very unhealthy. I mean, it's just, I think it was just yesterday, the day before, he referred to the states as agents of the federal government. Well, that's not what federalism is about. Federalism is we want to disperse power to the states so we don't centralize it all in the federal government. Not that the states are just the agent of the president of the United States. So his basic philosophy of government seems to be completely antithetical to what I think of as traditional republicanism. So yeah. I don't feel comfortable, and that's why I actually left the Republican Party, and I'd go back. If we get somebody in the future like a Mitt Romney, I'd be happy to go back to the Republican Party. I think Mitt Romney would have been a great president, by the way. And I got to know him when he was running, and I got to work with him. I think he's a really great human being too. I think he's just a really good person.
Yeah, I agree.
And maybe the Republican Party will go back to that. I don't see the path there yet, but that politics changes very rapidly. So who knows what the future holds.
Question: how financially secure do you feel? Do you have enough money to retire? How much is enough? And if you don't have enough, how can you possibly find that money before you retire? Tough questions. One smart answer: Maxify. Maxify is the powerful online planning tool that takes the guesswork out of retirement. Maxify compares your assets against your fixed expenses to calculate how much you can safely spend every year for the rest of your life. And it shows you safe ways to find more money. Developed by Boston University economist Lawrence Kotlikoff, Maxify makes a complicated problem like retirement planning simple. Maxify. Powerful, accurate, easy to use. Want some peace of mind? Make the smart choice. Maxify. Visit Maxify.com today to start planning. That's Maxify with an I. Maxify. Maxify.com.
So anyway, let's talk about your awesome research that propelled you to become a tenured professor at the tender age of 29. Was that the youngest age of any?
No, I think Larry was 28. Larry Summers
got tenure at 28.
28. In fact, at 20, I got a voted tenure by the department on my birthday, on my 29th birthday.
Oh, okay.
So if one day earlier, I would have been 28.
That's okay. So you would have tied with him. Jeff Sachs also got a tenure very early, right?
I think so. I think he might have been 28 as well. I'm not sure about that one though.
Yeah. So, but I don't know. Yeah.
It was back then. The path to being a professor was much shorter than it is today. I mean, today PhDs are longer. A lot of students do these pre-docs for a couple of years. Yeah. So, and then sometimes people do postdocs. So, the path between college and a full professorship is just longer now than back when we were young.
Right. So anyway, you started tell if you look through your oeuvre here, your work. What are the give us a little tour and
Sure.
stop at the places that you want to spend some time to revisit for a
Sure.
while.
I'll just sort of mention a few. I'm very bad at judging my own research, like what's important, what's not important. So I'm going to talk about my most cited papers. I'm assuming that citations are reasonable proxy for importance, but
That's good.
it's probably better than my subjective judgments. So I'll mention a few of my most cited papers. The first paper I wrote that's turned out to be widely cited is something I wrote as a grad student. It's
Mhm.
called Small Menu Costs in Large Business Cycles, the Macroeconomic Model of Monopoly. And that topic really goes back to my undergraduate thesis I wrote with, it wasn't in my undergraduate thesis, but the ideas that I was trying to figure out go back to my undergraduate thesis with Alan Blinder. And I wrote that in my first couple of years of grad school. And then eventually got published, I think, in what year was it published? 85 in the QJE.
Quarterly Journal of Economics. Yeah.
Yes, the Quarterly Journal of Economics.
Top five journals in economics.
The basic question I was thinking about was, but why? What is the essence of Keynesian economics? I think this is a period of time where Lucas and Sargent and the whole new classical revolution was kind of underway. They were throwing out basic Keynesian economics, and
Just tell everybody who Lucas and Sargent are.
okay. Oh, I'm sorry. Okay.
Maybe even a little bit of Keynesian.
So for Robert Lucas, Tom Sargent, both Nobel Prize winning economists. Robert Lucas at the University of Chicago, Tom Sargent was at University of Minnesota, and Ed Prescott, also University of Minnesota, came along, and they were basically trying to redo business cycle theory and reject a lot of basic Keynesian ideas. And it seemed to me that the foundation of Keynesian ideas that was important and that they were throwing out the baby with the bathwater, was the idea that prices are sticky. They don't move in the short run to balance supply and demand, and that's that short run stickiness that makes monetary policy have effects on the real economy. And so I spent a lot of time in my undergraduate thesis and the first few years of grad school trying to figure out, why did I think that prices were sticky? And the basic point of this particular paper was saying, well, the costs of price adjustment, the frictions that cause prices to be sticky, could be fairly small from the standpoint of the individual firm, but could have larger macroeconomic effects. And that's what the idea of the small menu costs, small frictions of price adjustment, but large business cycles. That is pretty big macroeconomic effects. And that was
Let me just interject for everybody who's not an economist, that Keynesian refers to John Maynard Keynes, who was the great British economist who wrote a book called the General Theory, of price.
employment, interest, and money. The general theory of employment, interest, and money.
Yeah. So it was a very unassuming title, the General Theory.
Yeah, not
And
a general theory, it's the general theory.
it's it's kind of like the Bible. You can make whatever you want out of it, really. But a lot of his emphasis was on the fact that markets don't function. We're in the middle of the Great Depression, and he's trying to understand why supply isn't equaling demand and why we have 25% unemployment. At least we did in the early 30s in our country. Major problems in Europe as well at this time. And he's writing a lot of different things in the book, but he is emphasizing that prices are not adjusting like the textbooks would suggest. And here you have sticky prices is trying to really understand exactly what might be going on. So you're trying to really give a rationale for sticky prices.
Yes. And so that paper, together with a lot of papers by other people working in what eventually was called the New Keynesian School, sort of put sticky prices back on the map. And I wasn't the only person doing this, but there are people like Olivier Blanchard, and then David Romer and Larry Ball, and then later Jordi Galli and Mike Woodford. I think that whole literature contributed to what is now sort of a new Keynesian consensus. So if you look at a lot of the stuff that Prescott was pushing, like real business cycle theory, I don't think that's dominant today at the graduate level
So there was these
macroeconomics
guys
courses.
basically centered around Chicago, the Midwest. They're called the freshwater economists. We
Right, right.
Lake Michigan, and then we got the saltwater economists here in Harvard, MIT, and there was this big real fight between the macroeconomists here and there, and the freshwater economists were saying that this view that the markets don't work is uh, passe, or it's not founded on anything fundamental. It's just made up. It just assumed out of the blue, and that we're going to write down models where markets do work and trying to understand the real world uh, and trying to interpret the real world from the perspective of those models. And they have produced a huge literature in that area, and they developed something called rational expectations, which suggested that agents were rational and had very important policy implications, that if they're rational, they can think through what the government's going to do, and therefore the government policy, especially monetary policy, uh, wouldn't be at all effective. It would be anticipated, so everybody would know ahead of time what the government's going to do because they can think through what even what our Jerome Powell would be thinking for over breakfast because but tell us why in this paper, the seminal paper, small costs of it, and this goes back to a restaurant having to change its menu. Literally,
Right.
there's a cost to that, right? You have to print a new menu, come up with new prices, think them over. Why does that then translate into large macro effects if everybody's doing it?
Yeah, well, the basic idea was that there was a pre-existing distortion. That is, the assumption here was that every firm is slightly monopolistic. So you think of a world where, so in a world of perfect competition, nobody's really setting prices. Markets are setting prices. Everybody's a price taker.
Yeah.
If you want to think about people setting prices, you have to think about every firm having a little degree of monopoly power. It's sometimes economists call monopolistic competition. It sounds like an oxymoron, but it actually makes sense in the context of the theory. So every firm has a little bit of monopoly power, and there's that pre-existing distortion. And because of that pre-existing distortion of monopoly, the broader economic implications of a price change can be larger than the effects on the particular firm. And showing that analytically was that. I mean, it's a theory paper in the sense that there's no data in it. It's really just it's an exercise in theory, but it's actually pretty lowbrow theory. There's nothing you couldn't teach to your undergraduates in that paper. Doesn't use a lot of math, but it's basically making that point, which is then picked up by Blanchard and Kiyotaki and Ball and Romer, building more sophisticated models with that central insight as part of it. And so that I think was chronologically that was my first hit. My second hit, I think, was with a paper with John Campbell, actually a couple papers with John Campbell series, looking at to what extent the rational expectations explains, together with the lack of any other frictions like borrowing constraints, to what extent that model explains the consumption data. That paper is called Consumption, Income, and Interest Rates, Reinterpreting the Time Series Evidence. And it really builds on a very famous paper by Robert Hall, a Stanford economist in 1978. And Hall concluded that the permanent income hypothesis with rational expectations explained the data pretty well. And John and I questioned that. And we introduced a model that said there's two kinds of people. There's some people who do obey the permanent income hypothesis, so their consumption is based on lifetime income, not just with current income. But some people are living hand to mouth, and these hand to mouth consumers basically consume based on what they're earning today, not based on their rational expectation of lifetime earnings. And we came up with a econometric way to estimate what fraction of consumption was done by each group. We concluded it was pretty close to 50-50. So there's a lot of people out there living
So how did you,
hand to mouth.
so a couple things for people who aren't like us nerdy economists, but the rational this model of rational agents would be ones where I'm thinking about, should I consume today versus put money aside, save it, spend it a year from now or at some future date. And I've got to think about how much happiness am I giving up today? How much marginal utility am I, that's the change in utility if I don't consume today versus what will I get in additional utility next year. But there's uncertainty as to whether or not I'll, my earnings will be high or my interest rates will be high. So I have to kind of compare the loss of my in utility today of giving up some consumption versus the expected gain in utility. And this incorporates risk aversion. So anyway, and there's a way to see whether or not that behavior is rational. And basically, if I'm making that decision, then things that I already know about shouldn't be impacting the I shouldn't have any. I shouldn't be changing my consumption or adjusting my consumption based on things I know about because they're not new information. So it's pretty important paper that Bob Hall came up with. But how did you actually tease out? Because I forget the paper at this point. Is a little bit.
Well, we basically had an instrumental variables test, which is a particular statistical technique, which I won't bore your listeners with detail, but basically a way to identify predictable changes in income. And if the rational expectations theory were right, the Bob Hall theory was right, then those predictable changes in income shouldn't lead to predictable changes in consumption, because all that future income, either high or low, should have been reflected in consumption today. And what we found was that those predictable changes in income were correlated with predictable changes in consumption. Basically 1 for 2. There's a 1% predictable change in income will lead to a 0.5% predictable change in consumption. And it was that relationship that basically led us to conclude that there's a lot of hand-to-mouth consumers out there not obeying the permanent income hypothesis. Now, let me just say something about these two papers together. If you look at what's being taught at the state-of-the-art graduate schools today, the state-of-the-art business cycle model is something that's called the Hank model. And Hank stands for heterogeneous agent new Keynesian model. And you could and it's much more complicated than anything I've just done or described, much more mathematically sophisticated. But both of those pieces tie back into stuff I was doing back in the 80s. So the new Keynesian part was this menu cost stuff, looking at sticky prices. And the heterogeneous agent stuff was exactly the stuff with Campbell on people are different. Not everybody's exactly the same. Now, heterogeneity is much more sophisticated in the model, so I wouldn't say that we saw it all. It's gotten, the current state is much more sophisticated, but it all sort of does trace back to ideas that I and my co-authors were thinking about back in the 1980s.
Want more money, less risk, and a better life? Buy Money Magic, a new book by Lawrence Kotlikoff, Boston University economist, personal finance expert, and best-selling author. Whether it's education, career, marriage, housing, investing, retirement, Social Security, IRA, or 401k decisions, Money Magic delivers scores of secrets to raise your living standard. Financial journalist Jane Bryant Quinn says Money Magic is a must-read. Nobel laureate George Akerlof says Money Magic is quite probably the best financial advice book ever written. Financial guru John Malden says, you'll love this amazing book. It's full of wit, wisdom, and startling paths to a better financial life. And columnist Scott Burns calls Money Magic a funny, brilliant read, offering wildly powerful, unconventional choices that can literally change your life. Get Lawrence Kotlikoff's Money Magic today at Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and independent booksellers.
So let me just try and phrase this slightly, this issue of the rational behavior. If you're sitting here trying to make decisions and you know something's coming, you should be taking that into account. And statistically, one can test to see whether things that were known are influencing decisions in the future about consumption when they shouldn't, because you should be taking that into account. It's just like things that are known should not be affecting asset prices, changes in asset prices. So it's very much of a rational, efficient
No,
market.
that's right. No, and Bob Hall's big insight in that 1970s paper was that consumption is a lot like an asset price. It should be forward looking. And so just like if you know that a company is going to be profitable tomorrow, well, that should be reflecting the price today. Similarly, if you know you're going to have a high income tomorrow, that should be reflecting your consumption today. And so
Right.
he basically pointed out that a lot of the tests that people were doing with asset prices can be applied equally well to consumption. That was, I think, a big conceptual breakthrough.
Yeah. So just before we go to the next major contribution here, I just want to pause to say that it's striking me, now that we're discussing this, and I haven't been a major consumer of this literature. I've been, kind of been an observer. I've worked on other areas, so I'm not seeped in this literature. But now that I see a little more about the origins, I'm wondering whether I'm not looking at the next Nobel laureate. Because,
That's not an issue for me to decide.
I mean, if you think about it, this really is the dominant theme in economics, macroeconomics these days, and you kind of transformed uh, the world from the rational expectations, all markets work, nobody's cash flow constrained, nobody's hand to mouth, uh, into this other world that actually has taken over the profession. Even the people in Chicago or the freshwater economists seem to be incorporating these assumptions about sticky prices in their modeling, if I'm not
Yeah,
mistaken.
absolutely. There's much more consensus now, I think, among young macroeconomists than there were when I was young. I think there
Yeah,
was this big schism between the Chicago, Minnesota crowd, as you called the freshwater group, versus the saltwater group, which included people in Harvard, MIT, BU,
it,
Stanford.
it was a lot more in some ways fun because we had basically warring parties. And even in the 50s, there was a warring party between the Cambridge, England, the Cambridge University economists, macro growth theorists, and the theorists at MIT, Samuelson and Solow.
Yes,
There was this Cambridge controversy.
right.
And
Cambridge. Yeah, two Cambridges, right?
then we had this huge fight between the guys in Chicago and that area, Minnesota, so forth. I remember I was at Yale after grad school as an associate professor, and I remember how upset James Tobin was about Robert Lucas. I mean, he was kind of apoplectic about
Yes.
he just hated Lucas. I mean, it wasn't intellectual, it was physical.
Yeah, yeah, there's a sense in which that those kind of academic debates are exciting, and there's a sense in which they're exhausting.
Yeah,
I actually probably think a little bit more normal science, where people get along and have more of a common research program, is probably healthier.
better for the profession. Yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely. But the
but I have to
personality,
admit, at the time when I was a young man, I think those intellectual battles were slightly invigorating. Maybe I was attracted too much to them, a little bit like a bar fight or something. You can't not watch. It breaks out, even though you wish it weren't happening.
exactly. But anyway, let's go to the next major contribution here that
Okay, the
and you
next one,
get two prizes.
chronologically, was a paper I wrote with David Romer and David Weil called "A Contribution to the Empirics of Economic Growth." And that actually paper I started writing that when I was writing my intermediate macro textbook. Because one of the things I was doing in writing my intermediate macro textbook was teaching basic models. And one of the basic models I made quite prominent was the Solow growth model. The Solow growth model was a very famous model of economic growth introduced in the 1950s, as you know, Larry. Um, and Bob Solow won the Nobel Prize basically for it. He called his paper a contribution to the theory of economic growth. And so our paper was a contribution to the empirics of economic growth. And as I was writing the chapters of my book teaching that, I kept thinking, okay, what's the evidence for the Solow model? I mean, Solow's paper was purely theory. There was no evidence. But roughly at this time, international GDP data had become more widely available thanks to the work of Robert Summers and Alan Heston. So they all of a sudden we started having really good international data. And I started saying, well, maybe we can use this international data to actually come up with some testable predictions of the Solow model. So I could actually show in the textbook that this model had some degree of truth to it. And then, so I started talking about that question with David Romer, who's my longtime friend. I mean, David Romer and I were undergraduates together at Princeton. And then we both came to MIT. And I think he was visiting the NBR that year when we wrote this paper. And I was best man at his wedding, he was best man at my wedding. So we've been friends for a very long time. So I started talking to David Romer, and then and David Weil was my a graduate student at the time. So I started talking to David Weil about it too. And so we started thinking about how could we use this new international data to test the Solow growth model. And there's already a literature on cross-country growth regressions. Robert Barrow, I think, was one of the early people doing this. But most of those early didn't have a lot of theoretical structure imposed on them. We would actually use the Solow model to come up to derive equations that you can actually test with this international data. And so basically we did that, and we basically sort of showed how you can sort of do cross-country growth regressions guided by the Solow model. And we concluded that the basic Solow model doesn't work too well. The parameters are off. But if you added human capital to it, it did a lot better at explaining the international evidence. And so that was basically that paper. At the time, I don't think we know how it would be received. Some of the new people who were doing, like the endogenous growth folk who were rejecting the Solow model, like Paul Romer, I don't think liked it very much. But it also got published in the Quarterly Journal of Economics, and it's turned out to be my most cited paper. I'm looking right now at my Google Scholar page. It's got almost 28,000 citations, which is a lot. And
that's amazing.
And so that at the time I didn't know this, but that's turned out my most cited paper by far. And it was basically a great collaboration between two of my favorite economists. I mean, David Weil's gone on to a very successful career at Brown, where he's done a lot of work in economic growth, and David Romer, of course, has also had a very successful career. Most recently, writing lots of papers with his colleague and wife, Christy Romer, often on monetary and fiscal policy.
Also, former head of the Council of Economic Advisors.
Christy Romer was, yes, Christy. Yeah.
Okay, so take us to keep going.
Oh, another other papers. Okay, I'm going to go down I'll go down my list here. Just mention a few others. Back in the 80s, when I was thinking about monopoly, do this menu cost paper, I happened to run on this. I was on the Red Line, going to, I think, from Harvard Square to Kendall Square, where I was living there closer to Harvard Square, and I was at my student at MIT. And I ran into Mike Winston, who was one of my classmates at MIT. And I started asking him questions like, okay, in monopolistic competition, it seems that it's not clear whether there's too much or too little entry. I mean, we think of entry as good, it creates competition, but on the other hand, there's you're paying more fixed costs if there's increasing returns, so that might be bad if you're not taking advantage. So is it generally true in the monopolistic competition you get too much or too little entry? And so he's more of a theorist than I am, much more of a theorist, and particularly he went on to a career in an industrial organization. And I basically posed a question to him on the subway, and he said, "Well, I don't really know the answer to that." And so, even though he was an IO economist, and so he and I started working on that topic, and we ended up writing a paper called "Free Entry and Social Inefficiency," the conditions under which you get too much or too little entry under conditions of monopolistic competition. And that was we introduced a term called the business stealing effect, which is that if when a new firm enters, they take business away from other firms. So some of the profit goes to other firms. Then you have too much of an incentive to enter, because you're basically that's a form of an externality, because some of the profits that you're getting aren't really creation of new value. It's just shifting profits from somebody else. And we call that the business stealing effect. And that shows up actually in the literature now fairly often, the term business stealing effect. People often don't know that we termed it. I remember when we talked to Mike, when Mike and I were talking about this, we had to say, okay, well, there's this effect here. What are we going to call it? We needed a name for it. And I remember he came in one day and he said, how about the business stealing effect? And I thought, oh yeah, that's great. That's a great name. And so I'm pretty sure we coined that term in the literature, which now I think shows up in a lot of different kind of contexts of monopolistic competition.
You're saying that in some contexts, it would be better to restrict entry, let these companies have excess profits, monopolize, because the alternative would be excessive fixed costs.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Shortly after the paper was circulated, maybe it was published, I can't remember. We got an inquiry from some trade association. I think it was the trucking association or something, saying, these two Harvard, we were both Harvard professors at the time, and assistant professors. I don't think we were tenured quite yet. But they say, we would love to have you consult with our organization because, we've been plagued by excessive entry forever. Of course, well, nobody likes entry. As a textbook author, I hate it when new people enter to write textbook. But all producers hate competition, right? That's the nature of being a producer. They want us to consult with them to prove that there's too much entry and the government should limit entry to trucking. We said, no. This is a theory paper. We weren't going to sort of lobby for more government intervention, but they obviously like that. So we didn't do that. I thought that was pretty funny.
So we have time for another. I think we have 10 more minutes. Let's do
okay.
Through another bunch of papers.
Okay. I'll just let me mention just one more. I have a paper with Steve Zeldis, published in '91. So basically, if you look at my most cited papers there, I'm going to do two more. I'm going to also one of Reese after this. It's the one of Steve Zeldis. It's called The Consumption of Stockholders and Non-Stockholders. There's this puzzle out there called the equity premium puzzle, originally introduced by Ed Prescott, a professor, which we mentioned earlier, a professor at University of Minnesota. And he wrote a paper with Raj Mehra, basically said that the equity premium, that is excess return on stocks over safe assets, like treasury bills, that return is pretty big. It's like 6-7% historically. And he's saying, that's presumably a compensation for risk. Is that the right amount of compensation for risk?
I'm just opening the door for our cat. Keep talking.
Okay. So that's fine. So what Prescott and Mehra concluded was that when you actually looked at the amount of risk associated with equities, that the equity premium should be a lot smaller than it is, much smaller than it is. They couldn't really explain an equity premium of 6 or 7%. So their paper was titled "The Equity Premium: A Puzzle" because they thought it was puzzling that the equity premium was so big, given how much inherent risk is. And what Steve Zeldis and I did is we said, well, maybe the problem is that Mehra and Prescott assume that everybody holds equities. In fact, a lot of people don't hold equities. And so you really shouldn't be looking at the risk, the consumption risk of everybody. You should be looking at the risk, particularly of equity holders. And so what we did is we got data at the individual level from the PSID, panel study of income dynamics, on individual consumption. And we basically compared the consumption dynamics for people who do own equities and the people who don't own equities. And what we showed is that the consumption of equity holders was both more volatile and more strongly correlated to the stock market than the consumption of non-equity holders. And that helped explain the size of the equity premium. Now, the reason I want to mention this paper is partly it's the specific contribution of the equity premium, but it sort of gets back to this idea of heterogeneity. Similar to my paper with John Campbell, we said some people are hand to mouth, some people are not. Here we had some people are investing in the equity market, some people are not. Those are different people. And to understand consumers, you really have to dive deep into the kinds of heterogeneity that they are.
So did you fully resolve? What fraction of the puzzle did you resolve, do you think?
No, not the whole thing, for sure. But some we managed to get the amount of risk aversion you needed to explain it much more significantly. I can't remember the exact numbers. So it makes a big step in that direction, but we never claimed to fully explain it.
Yeah.
I have other hypotheses to what might explain it, but the rest of it. But but yeah, I think so. This was one piece of the puzzle. That was an empirical paper, and then and the last paper I'll mention to you, which is the most recent I wrote. This came out in 2002, the most recent of my highly cited papers. But this is with Ricardo Rice, who's a star economist at the London School of Economics. But at the time we wrote this paper, he was a grad student at Harvard. One of the sort of centerpieces of Keynesian economics is the Phillips curve. So there's this thing that explains it relates inflation to unemployment. The standard model of the Phillips curve is a model that comes from what's called the New Keynesian Phillips curve. It basically comes from the work of Calvo and Julio Rottenberg. But they had a particular way of deriving the Phillips curve from first principles. But and it's a beautifully elegant model, and it's the centerpiece for a lot of work in the Phillips curve today, to this day.
And just by the way, folks, the Phillips curve is this relationship between unemployment and inflation, and a lot of discussion about whether there's a trade-off, higher inflation, less unemployment, lower inflation, more unemployment.
Exactly.
Exactly.
This goes back to Phillips, who's a New Zealand-born economist at the London School of Economics, and he wrote a paper about this in the, I guess, 50s or something, and then it's been part of the macroeconomics literature really for 75 years.
If you think about it intuitively, if prices are kind of fixed and you pump a lot of money into the economy, people have more money to spend, and prices are fixed, then their real demands can be higher, and that can juice up the economy, and you can have more employment, less unemployment, if I'm saying it clearly.
Yeah, but eventually that'll lead to inflation.
Yes.
Yes, exactly. So anyway, so the particular model of the Phillips curve, the New Keynesian one, had some weird properties, and I won't go into them now, that to us didn't seem to fit the data. And we basically we were trying to come up with another way to sort of explain the Phillips curve that didn't. And we introduced this idea called sticky information, which is the idea that there are some people who are setting prices out there that are doing it based on outdated information. And in some sense, we were influenced by the behavioral economists. People like David Leibson had been talking about sort of inattention as being one of the phenomena that they seem to observe in a variety of contexts when they study consumption, for example. But we said, well, could it be sort of inattention, what we call sticky information? Could that explain inflation dynamics in a way that gives you a Phillips curve that's sort of more consistent with the data, and so that's what we proposed. So that paper was titled "Sticky Information versus Sticky Prices: A Proposal to Replace the New Keynesian Phillips Curve," and that came out, as I said, in Quarterly Journal of Economics, 2002. That's actually my second most cited paper. It's got just under 4,000 citations.
And the sticky information, who's sticky with respect to that information?
The price setters. The
price
setters.
So firms
Yes.
are kind of, they can't, so economics doesn't really kind of take, the purest theory doesn't realize that we only have 24 hours in a day, and we can't be setting the price optimally in every nanosecond of the things that we're selling. So we might need to kind of decide, hey, I'll look at this in a couple of weeks, but I don't have the time right now, or maybe even a couple of months. And during this period of time, you've got the wrong price being set because other things are happening in the market where if you had spent the time, you would have adjusted your price. So that's the idea of inattention, and it's rational inattention, not irrational. It's because it's rational not to look all the time because you'd have no time to actually do anything else, right?
That's right. I mean, that's right. So even the fully rational model would say when Jerome Powell changes monetary policy, you as a price setter running your little barbershop are going to, take that into account in setting your prices. My guess is if you talk to your barber about it, he has no idea who Jerome Powell is. He's certainly not setting his prices based on what Jerome Powell is doing with monetary policy. So, so the idea was trying to build a little bit of that inattention. And given that your barber probably has lots of things to think about beyond monetary policy, it's probably smart for him not to bother trying to figure out what monetary policy means for him. So that was just trying to build that degree of sort of behavioral inattention. And it's kind of funny. I think I learned from my colleagues like David Leibson, the behavioral economists, to be willing to make assumptions like that. Early in my career, I would have been I was so constrained by this rational man model that I probably wouldn't have felt comfortable making that sort of assumption. By 2002, I was 20 years out of grad school almost. I was almost more comfortable making looser assumptions to try to fit the data a little better.
Now, okay, so we've gone through the papers that everybody else thinks are your greatest hits. Do you have any couple papers that you think have been, let's say, or that you really love that maybe haven't been given enough attention or
I'm very bad. I think people are very bad at judging their own work, so I'm always reluctant to say that. I've written a series of papers on fiscal policy and government debt, which I think are good. Have got some attention, not as much attention as ones we've talked about. But I had a paper with about dynamic efficiency, meaning how do you evaluate whether our country has accumulated too much capital, and therefore whether crowding out capital is bad. That was a paper with Andy Abel, Larry Summers, and Dick Zeckhauser. I wrote some related papers with Larry Ball on intergenerational risk sharing, government debt, and some more recent work on and models of monopolistic competition in government debt. So there's a fiscal policy subliterature I've been working in that has not gotten as much attention as these papers I've already talked about. But I actually like that line of work. It's actually it's related to some of the stuff you're working on too, Larry.
Yeah, I was just going to say I'm a big fan of that work on intergenerational risk sharing, and I mean a lot of people rationalize policies like Social Security pay as you go as somehow, we see we're taking from young people, giving to old people, and then telling young people, don't worry, when you're old, you can take from your kids, and then they can take from their kids, and it looks like a Ponzi scheme, right? Some people have rationalized this, supporters of Social Security, gets to be political, that, well, Social Security is here to help particular generations that face bad times, that it's a risk-sharing mechanism. Of course, that would suggest it should go in both directions, that risk sharing should not just be taking from the young and giving to the old all the time, but in certain times you do that. But in other times when the old are really benefiting from maybe really high returns, like on the market like today, they should be paying to the young. They should be hit with higher taxes. And Greg, together with Larry Ball, wrote, I think, the definitive theoretical optimal risk sharing paper on this, and probably, maybe 100 people have read it, maybe 1,000, but I'm certainly read it very carefully and have cited it. And it's important, and it leads to it's important because some people look at what were before recent years, before we've had interest rates go up. But if you go back to the late 90s, interest rates were quite low, and some people have been arguing that hey, this is a time for the government to borrow money because it doesn't have to pay back, and it can just roll over the borrowing because the interest rates are so low, and we can borrow from young people, give to old people, expand our debt, and nobody will get hurt. It's like a free ride. And that's not the prescription necessarily from your work or economic theory in general. Anyway, let's see if we can close this with your general view of the state of economics as a science. Are you happy with the way things are going? Are you a little bit?
Well, what I'm unhappy about is we have less influence now, I think, in Washington than we ever have. If you look at the current administration, for example, there's not a lot of mainstream economists floating around there. Right. In previous administrations, both Republican and Democrat, you could probably find a dozen people you'd be happy to have in the Harvard or BU economics department, as a colleague. I think it'd be harder pressed to find that in the current administration. So they've not hired the top talents of economics, and the policies reflect that. I mean, we don't, you know, you get people like Peter Navarro and arguing in favor of trade restrictions. That's just sort of bad. I think it's bad. Most economists would agree that's just bad policy, bad economics. So I'm frustrated by that. Now, as far as academias go, I think there's a lot of great young economists out there. I look at my young colleagues at Harvard, and I'm super impressed that they're there. And I mean, the two young macroeconomists we have at Harvard now are Gabriel Chatterall-Reich and Ludwig Straub. Those are the two young, most recently tenured macroeconomists. They're great. So I could pick a name of similar people at other universities, but so basically, I think the economics profession as a scientific endeavor, I think, is doing fine, actually, doing very well. And then you have people like Raj Chetty who are doing wonderful things with huge big data, analyzing data sets I couldn't have even imagined doing with the computing power we had when we were their age.
So last question, do you think AI is going to put us out of business?
No.
Do you think
I
it's
don't
going
think so.
I
don't think so. I think it might be helpful. I don't know. I think it might be helpful. I mean, it's pretty good at doing math, and so sometimes if I have a math problem, I don't want to bother doing the algebra myself. I can put it into ChatGPT. I don't think it gets it right 3 out of 4 times. I mean, 1 out of 4 times it makes a mistake, and I can see, but it shows you its logic, and so you can sometimes correct the mistake. So I think that'll actually be helpful. So no, I'm not worried about AI putting us out of business.
What about the economy at large? Since you are one of the top macroeconomists in the country, the world, how do you see AI's impact on U.S. growth, on employment, do you see this as are we going to end up, we've been heading to being a service economy, went from like 30% of workers in manufacturing down to about 8% now. And these MAGA policies haven't changed that. The tariffs haven't changed that. And we have people writing articles that say that 40% of jobs or so are at risk because of AI. What's your take? Are you concerned?
I think in the short run, there'll be a lot of difficult transition costs. For the long run, it'll be a plus. And let me sort of explain both of those conclusions. In the short run, there'll be people who are put out of work who are not going to be easily retrained for something else. So, there's probably 1 million, mostly middle-aged men who are truck drivers, driving long-haul trucks. Not very long in the future, there'll be self-driving trucks, which are probably safer for everybody. But if that puts, 1 million middle-aged men out of work, that's going to be a real problem for them because, if you're a 55-year-old guy who's been driving a long-haul truck, you're not going to be easily trained to another job very quickly. And no amount of social safety net is going to make up a large fraction of your income. So that's going to be very difficult. Long term, I think what we know is that technological change creates new jobs that we can't quite imagine, and we're better off because of it. The example I always give to my students is farming. If 200 years ago you went to the Americans and said, in the future only 2% of people are going to be farmers, and we'll produce enough food for everybody to eat plus to export. They would say, "Oh my gosh, what are people going to do with all their time if they're not farmers?" Because most people were farmers. And you said, "Oh, don't worry, there'll be CAT scan operators, there'll be website designers." Right? You list a whole bunch of jobs that people do now, and the people 200 years ago had no idea what that meant.
Yeah.
Similarly, I'm sure there will be jobs in the future that we can't quite imagine today. They will be created over time, and we'll be fine. So I think in the long term, this is all a good development, but these transitions are very difficult. As we knew for farming. I mean, for farming, that's why we have all these farm price supports and stuff like that. A lot of farm policies because farmers struggled as we needed fewer and fewer of them. And that'll be the nature of a lot of industries in the next.
Yeah, this will never. 1890 we had 50,000. I think 5 million horses at work, I believe, or 50 million, some huge number. Today we have a really small number of horses, and they're all out to pasture. And I'm wondering whether humans could end up out to pasture as well, or whether we're, the inequality is so everybody might have some kind of a job, like, helping somebody else carry groceries. We could go from a service economy to a servant economy. Uh, is that a part of you? I mean, do you have that concern that we're going to have increasing inequality? We've seen some significant evidence of that in recent decades. Do you see this as a huge problem?
Well, that's a good question. I don't know. I mean, you might think that after all, artificial intelligence is supposed to be intelligent, so maybe it's going to replace the high cognitive jobs rather than the low cognitive jobs, right? I mean, we think of most technological progress. This is the Claudia Gold and Larry Katz book is on this. Most technological progress tends to be skill biased, meaning it's easier to automate low skilled jobs than high skilled jobs. AI may be an example of the opposite, where if you're replacing the more cognitive jobs, and maybe that's something that's actually going to reduce inequality. We don't really know. I think it's impossible to say.
Okay, so I'll let us end on this note, this piece of information that it may be apocryphal, that I heard from someone that I was interviewing the other day, former student who's pretty knowledgeable, he gets his facts right. He said that Harvard MBAs, graduates of Harvard Business School, are currently having trouble finding jobs.
Yep, I've heard that.
You've heard that too?
I've heard that too from several sources. Yes.
Wow. That's a huge statement because
I'm not sure that's just because of AI. I think there's maybe cyclical things going on. I think it's probably too early to say what AI's impact is going to be. But I've heard that about the Harvard MBAs having trouble getting jobs this year. I've heard that.
All right, Greg. Thanks a million. We're going to get you back. Keep pushing. You're extraordinary, and I think the prize is going to come your way. But who cares about that? Just what we need is you to keep writing away and teaching away. And everybody, here's one of the world's great economists. Thanks again.
Thank you, Larry. It's been delightful.
Thank you.